So when your relationship with your vendor is starting to head down in a bad direction, you'll want to take some preliminary steps to prepare. And so you can have a successful termination process. I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's really important to get ahead of termination. You don't just want to terminate suddenly out of the gate without any preparation. So here are the 4 steps that I recommend in order to prepare for a termination. So start with a discussion with your team. So you want to make sure that they stay in full compliance with all the contract obligations until the termination is complete. This is a problem I see with a lot of contract terminations. So your team knows you're going to be terminating. They believe the other side breached the contract. So they just stop performing. And what happens is the other side actually didn't breach. Maybe there was a misunderstanding or whatever, but the judge or arbitrator will find that what the counterparty did was not a breach. Now, suddenly your side is the one that breached first and created all the problems. So I always encourage my teams to make sure they're in full compliance with the contracts until we have finished termination, until it's officially done. The second step that I require is have at least one written notice sent to the file in advance of when you want to terminate. So if you're planning, you're reading the files, you're talking to your team, it's a disaster, and you really want to get out, your first written notice to the other side should not be a termination notice. There's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, a lot of litigation strategy, but also just plain human psychology. You don't want to blindside people. People become emotional, they become irrational, they become indignant, all those bad things. So you really want people to know something's coming. It's kind of like with an employee. So if your employee's having performance problems, you don't want the first sign to be their termination meeting. You want to give them some advance notice. So the same with vendors. Make sure they know that there are issues before you actually terminate. The third step I recommend is to review your documentation of what you have now. So I find whoever's been talking to the other side, I get copies of their emails, I get copies of the reports, anything that's kind of gone back and forth, any notes or other things like that. This does a couple things. One, it gives me a fuller picture of what's going on. Two, it lets me know the tone that this person has set with the vendor. So I know if it's a very friendly tone, if it's aggravating, if it's hostile, that's good information for the attorney to have. The next thing, the other reason it's good for is that I get a sense of the case against us. Is there a lot of smoking guns either against, or are there a lot of smoking guns against the counterparty or against my client? So if my client has been admitting wrong or, doing other things to kind of undermine our case, I might take a much less aggressive approach to the termination than I would have done if the counterpart was true and the vendor had admitted fault and said it was all their problem and they were the cause. So getting on top of your current documentation is a real great step before you go through the termination process. And then the last part of this is really to develop a transition plan. It's so important that you don't just terminate without a contingency in place. So before you even get ready to send that termination notice, you're going to sit down with your team. You're going to talk about what they're going to do. So what's the new service that's going to replace this if there is one? If there's not, if there is one, you might want to sit down with the vendor, the new vendor, talk about what they're going to do. Make sure that the timing is aligned. So if you terminate on a Monday, but the new vendor isn't going to be ready to work until Friday, you may be in a lot of trouble. So you really want to make sure that the timeline works, the services flow works. You don't want to face any gaps if that's an important thing for you to avoid. So those are the tips for a successful termination. I hope you found them helpful.